Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor. I'm really pleased to have with me again Daniel McAdams. He's the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, good to have you back again.
So much for having
your website, the Institute's Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity website, is always very, very interesting to me. And there's new stuff up there almost every day, right?
Yeah, sure. We try to have several new things a day. Absolutely.
And one of the most amusing and sort of fun things that I came across was own a piece of Ron Paul history. It's a picture of Ron Paul's car when he first went into Congress, I guess, parked next to Tip O'Neill's very expensive car. Ron had a Chevette or something like that.
79 Chevette, exactly.
Yeah, a four-door sedan, and he had it parked next to Tip O'Neill. And I think it was somebody that said, the government is like Tip O'Neill, big, fat, and out of control. The U.S. government is like, I don't know, it was Ronald Reagan that said that. Of course, Ronald Reagan, as David Stockman has told us on this show and has talked about, not in such flattering terms about Ronald Reagan either, because Ronald Reagan spent untold billions and billions of dollars for the defense, so-called defense or whatever. But interesting article there. Just take a minute and tell us a little bit about what that's about.
Well, it's a great story, and actually, our old friend Lou Rockwell was part of the mischief. He had Ron's Chevette parked next to Tip's monster limousine after Tip had said that everyone's going to have to cut back and start going into the gas rationing lines. And of course,
Except
Tip
him.
had his own gas pump inside the Capitol, so he would not have to deal with any rationing. So apparently, Tip just flew through the roof. And, this car was purchased by Dr. Paul in 1979 when he went back to Congress. So it's a pretty, if you look at the pictures, it's a pretty modest car.
Yeah.
And, of course, he paid for it himself. And, but it has a neat history. And so Dr. Paul is basically going to hand the keys over as a gift to anyone who makes the highest pledge to his Institute for Peace and Prosperity.
Oh, what a great idea.
And it's a museum piece, and it'll even have the original congressional license plates that were on it when he drove it. So that's kind of a neat little piece of history available.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's one of the more fun things on the site today, I must say. I got a chuckle out of that. Some of the other things aren't so much fun, or not so funny, let's say, because what we're talking about is blood and treasury. Daniel, I have to ask you this, and there's so much to talk to you about, but I was driving to Ohio last week and late at night, and I heard on the radio some former reporter from the New York Times was talking about Iraq and how essentially Iraq is not only not our ally, but it seems to be working very closely with Iran and Syria and so forth. So he pointed out that after we spent $1 trillion of money and countless human lives, that in fact nothing has turned out the way it was supposed to in Iraq. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, the whole war on terror, the whole post-2001 endeavor to remake the Middle East has turned out that way, and it's not so much that they're not an ally, which is true to a degree, but it's a country in absolute chaos, yesterday I think there was a car bomb that went off and killed 55 people. Can you imagine if that? We sort of take it for granted; it just rolls off our back. Can you imagine if that happened every day or every other day somewhere in the U.S.? And proportionally, look at the populations between the two countries. So, it's an absolute disaster there, and everywhere we've tried to remake. Look at Egypt. Look at the great success story Tunisia, whose government is absolutely falling apart. Look at their grand plans for Libya. The whole place is run by these horrible militias. So everywhere they've tried to remake the world, it's just ended up a disaster.
Daniel, I'd like to get your sense of, and I know we've talked to your former colleague Jeff Deist about this, but I can't remember the numbers, and I didn't really get into it with Gene Epstein, but how much of our budget is involved in the military, with military spending? And I'm not talking, military spending.
Sure. Well, there are a couple of interesting figures, and when we talk about percentage of total expenditures, you have to go back to 2010, I think, for at least from what I've seen, and you've got between 28 and 38% of total budgeted expenditures. But when you look at it in terms of tax revenues, we're spending on military, and this is not defense. This is something that Dr. Paul always says. Defense is very different than military spending.
Absolutely.
Much of military spending is for the military-industrial complex. Defense spending is necessary, and it's a constitutional function of government. But when you talk about in terms of total tax revenue, in 2010, we spent between 42 and 57% total tax revenue on the military budget. So that is just an unsustainable level. You know, a country can't survive spending to this degree on militarism. You know, and it's and in 2009, U.S. military spending made up 40% of the global military spending. So we spend as much as 40% of the total spending in the world. So it's just incredible.
Wow. Who would come in next to that?
I don't have it in front of me. My guess.
You don't have it. Yeah. But I mean, with some of the bigger countries, with the European Union doesn't spend. We do their military stuff for them, right? The European Union.
China spends quite a bit. And
Russia some.
Yeah, sure. So
Iran and some of those countries.
But it's incredible. And if you look at 2012, it's interesting because you have between $1 and $1.4 trillion. And this is when you look at it, not just the DoD budget. You have to look at FBI's counterterrorism. You have to look at all of the stuff in the Energy Department, Homeland Security, the NASA satellites. But also you have to talk about interest on debt that we incurred in the past wars.
Sure.
And that's between $1 and $400 billion a year.
Wow.
So it's just an unsustainable level of spending. And, the so-called sequester that the military said would hollow out the military and, would be invaded, the sequester only reduced the level of defense spending increases, of military increase. So without the sequester, we would have increased military spending by 20% over the next 10 years. With this horrible draconian sequester, we only would increase it by 18% over the next.
Oh my goodness! So that's only difference, and we're hearing the screaming and hollering about that.
Sure.
So
exactly.
So somebody is getting a slight cutback in the goodies that are given to the privileged few. What about which brings me to a couple of more interesting articles in today's Ron Paul Institute website from NSA spying. Sweeps to domestic drones, roundup of the police state programs not affected by government shutdown. I guess that's what you're talking about. Those are the kinds of things. So Obama will still have his drones. Nothing to do there. I mean, if he wants to go after people that he thinks might be a threat for whatever reason, wants to kill them, he can do that, right?
Yeah, and it also shows you how the government views the rest of us. They'll have plenty of money to spy on us, to spy on everyone else. Right. To conduct all of these horrible wars overseas, to grope us at the airports, to go into sporting events and with dogs and sniff everyone, to enforce the Patriot Act. But all of these other things, there's just they won't have anything for. And of course, that's what the press does. They scare the rest of the country into thinking that the world will end. And so far, we're about 14, 15 hours into it, and I don't feel anything different, Jay. I don't know how you feel.
Well, I don't either. I imagine, I understand that some of the veterans might get cut back, the ones that, are not currently in the military, and it seems to me, again, that's a nice big thank you for the people that put their life on the line for the military-industrial complex. Look
Absolutely.
What they get.
And they're the easiest ones to rip off because they have less of a voice, and they are the first ones to get cut. These people who beat their chests and say we're not going to cut one penny from our military. Well, these guys serve too, and they earned the benefits that they have. So you're absolutely right.
There was another article, and I don't see it right now as I'm looking at the website, but there was another article basically talking about a false flag on the Damascus gas attacks. Can you talk about that?
Sure, that was an interesting report that came out, and I've been following this woman for quite some time. Her name is Mother Agnes Miriam of the Cross. She's the Mother Superior of a monastery of St. James near Homs in Syria, and she's not Syrian, but she's been there for some 20 years ministering to the Syrian Christians. But she put together a very interesting NGO, the Institute for Peace, Justice, and Human Rights. And they did I think it's about a 50-page deep analysis of all of these videos that were released, some of them by Senate Intelligence Committee and some by the government, that was supposedly proving that the Syrian regime, had done this August 21st chemical attack. And, it gets very complicated, but I have to say, looking at their report, there's more than we've been given by our own government. She points out very clearly, in using photographic evidence, that these same children are photographed in two separate sites at the same time. They seem to be used as props. You can see the same clothing, the same kids. Wow. And then in a lot of the pictures, you see there are no women at all in these seemingly staged photos. But the local morgue reported that there were quite a few women dead. So she basically just points out all of the anomalies and all of the very strange things around these videos that were supposed to prove that the Syrian government did it. So I think in the interest of a full debate, it's certainly worth considering the evidence that they've come up with.
Well, it's not much of a chance we're going to get a full debate, is there?
No. It's...
And why not? I mean, why not? If just Obama says, just trust us. We know what we're talking about. Yeah. I mean, as I just mentioned to Gene Epstein, Ronald Reagan noted that politics is the second oldest profession, has a great deal in common with the oldest profession, he said. So now we're supposed to just trust us, just trust the politicians, which of course the founders of this country didn't believe in doing at all. Daniel, you mentioned, and I think this is a point that Ron Paul made in his debates, that military spending isn't the same as defense spending. So how much do you think we really would need? I mean, I know this is not something that you've had time to think about very much, but how much are we spending? $1 trillion a year, 1.4 trillion a year in military?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How much would we need to defend, to keep the bad guys from coming into the United States in our 50-state territory?
Well, it's an interesting theoretical question. We could guess 10 cents on the dollar, less than that even. If you, do what the Swiss do, and everyone has their own gun and knows how to use it. If Mexico decided to invade, I think we wouldn't have too much trouble.
Oh, yeah, but if our government wants to invade, they don't want that.
Yeah, and Jay, the thing is, if you look up and down the corridor on the 28 here in Washington D.C. along the Dulles corridor, you see what the military-industrial complex has built. Mm-hmm. These people are living high on the hog.
Right,
no question
on the rest
about
of us.
it.
Yeah.
And the rest of the country is not in such good shape, I can assure you. If you see the new BMWs and Mercedes in these parking lots, they wrap themselves in the flag, but they're living awfully well.
Well, I was just out to my homeland of Ohio. It used to be when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, a relatively prosperous place because that was sort of the Rust Belt. What's now the Rust Belt. It was the industrial belt of the country, and there was, those people lived fairly well. But since the 70s, and especially since we went off the gold standard, we've seen a tremendous demise in the middle class. My engineer is telling me we are out of time. There's so much more I could ask you about, but certainly the whole thing, Daniel, that I would like to talk to you about sometime, perhaps get your feelings and sense about, is one of the arguments for a continued military invasion of other countries is the need to keep the dollar as our primary currency. And of course, that works very well for the people that can print money, because they get the first dibs, as Ron Paul has pointed out, and they live very, very well, those guys driving the Mercedes and BMWs. So that's just something that I'd like to talk to you about in the future when we've got time, but we don't have time today. So
sounds good.
I have to say goodbye and thank you very much again. And folks, it is the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Just Google that and go to this site. It's a wonderful site. Daniel writes, Ron Paul writes. Lots of intellectuals on foreign policy are writing here, giving you a view that's different from the warmed-over pablum that we get every day, the propaganda that is getting us to try to think and act in a way that serves the military-industrial complex. If you don't like that, go to Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and learn up as to what is really going on as opposed to what they want you to think is going on. Okay, thanks again, Daniel, for being with us.